Who enjoyed that, first of all? I really enjoyed that. I used to watch Leave It to Beaver every single day at 12 o'clock. I would come home from school for lunch, and I would watch Leave It to Beaver. And I probably seen the whole series 2 or 3 times as a result of that. So it was really great to revisit that. In fact, as a kid, I loved it because I guess I saw myself in Wally and Beaver, and so the funny thing is, there's some really funny jokes. Like, it's actually genuinely funny, and it's very well written, and it's very engaging, very wholesome, obviously. But as an adult, I haven't actually revisited this show. And it's weird because I've revisited tons of things from my childhood as an adult, and yet I've never really watched this again. But with a 16-month-year-old Timothy, 16-month-old son named Timothy, and with our son on the way. By the way, anyone who wasn't here last week or is not on Facebook, we're expecting another son, just so you know, if you didn't hear. So we're very happy about that. But with 2 young boys on the way, as a father of 2 young boys, I am now thinking to myself, well, wait a second, this show might actually be relevant to me in a very different way. I might see myself in Ward more than in the boys, obviously. And I actually found an article called The Moral Imagination of Leave It to Beaver, and it really opened my eyes to see that this show is an article written by somebody named Michael DeSapio. And he really demonstrated in this article that this show, Leave It to Beaver, you can pass it off and just write it off as just this old show from the 50s and early 60s, but it's actually a wonderfully written show, and it was intentionally written and made to demonstrate what a functional, healthy family is like. Like not everybody in the 1950s and 60s were perfect, right? In fact, the show actually even shows that. All of Wally's and Beaver's friends are not great, and their families' lives are not great. But the Cleavers, the name of the family in the show, have a great home life, right? Ward and June are the parents, and they're wonderful parents. And Wally and the Beaver, not perfect themselves, but they always learn from their experiences. And here's the thing. People, and I just want to quote a little bit from this article because I thought it was so interesting. People will remember Leave It to Beaver as a sanitized, unrealistic, or even cookie-cutter portrayal of a perfect nuclear family. And these are phrases that reveal a scorn for the very concepts of family, right? People will look back at the show and say, oh my goodness, how cliche and how old-fashioned is that? But Jerry Mathers himself, who plays the Beaver, he said that the series was like a medieval morality play in which Beaver repeatedly succumbed to temptation. He suffered the consequences, but then was guided back to the path of virtue, right? Look at that. That Beaver was always tempted by his friends to do something, as we saw in the episode. He was tempted to put on the ring, to even bring the ring to school and put it on. And he suffered the consequences of it. He had to get that ring cut off his finger. But he was always guided back to the path of virtue. And that's exactly, I think, what art should be. Show us that. But also, more specifically, what family life is supposed to be. Where, yes, we are going to face the temptations and the challenges of this world, but our family is almost like a haven in which we can come in and be protected from the outside world. And yes, we do have to suffer the consequences of the world, of our choices, but we are guided back to the path of virtue because of the protection and the guidance of our family, of our parents. And again, life is tough, right? And Satan is always out there looking to do something, to tempt us or to get us to do something, right? And sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes Satan is really obvious. And sometimes it takes the form of Eddie Haskell, right? Eddie Haskell was constantly trying to get Wally and Beaver into trouble and trying to get them to do stuff that they shouldn't have been doing, right? But that's just it. Life is full of temptations. And the key is to suffer the consequences and learn from them and be guided back to the path of virtue. And that is what family is supposed to be. I think Leave It to Beaver dramatized this wonderfully, and especially in the roles of Ward and June, the parents, right? In that article, it says that Ward exercised justice tempered with understanding, right? He was, as we saw in the episode, he was firm. He knew what was right, and he expected his boys to do what was right and to learn from their mistakes. But he was also very understanding, and he was also very compassionate towards his kids. And one thing the guy says in the article that was awesome that I remembered is often the boys would be talked to by Ward in his den. And in his den would be books all around. I've often... Who here has a man cave? Any guys out there have a man cave? I wouldn't mind having a nice man cave. I could put all my nerdy stuff in there. But the old version of a man cave was a library in your den, right? And that there's something to that within the traditional family, the role of the father is to bring the wisdom of life to your children. And that's exemplified in the idea of like a library, right? And of course, the mother, June, was full of, a quote here, full of grace. She was the heart of the Cleaver home, its source of grace and stability. Another quote here says, "The Cleaver family was founded in the loving marriage of Ward and June, a marriage characterized by companionship and mutual respect." Now, the show was not realistic, right? And it wasn't supposed to be. It was supposed to show us an ideal to strive toward. And again, that's what I think art should sometimes be, or often should be, is idealistic, archetypes that we are supposed to strive toward. That's why I like superheroes and that sort of thing. But here's the thing. So the show ran from the late 50s to the early 60s, and who here remembers the rest of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s? As the decades rolled on, times changed, did it not? And suddenly, the family was nowhere near, at least not the popular depiction of a family, was nowhere near what it was like in Leave It to Beaver. And when I was a kid and I watched TV, a favorite show of mine and of ours was this show called The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And if you remember this show, the parents, Philip and Vivian, they were very successful. They were actually very rich. They lived in Bel-Air, and they had 3 kids. But Vivian's nephew, Will Smith, came to live with them because he lived out in Philadelphia and he was going down the wrong path, right? So his mother wanted to send him to live with his aunt and uncle in Bel-Air and to be hopefully put on the right path. So in a sense, this show is kind of like Leave It to Beaver because it was to show that Will would often be faced with challenges and would do the wrong thing, but Philip, his aunt and uncle, would be there to guide him back to the path of virtue. But again, even though this show had heart, and even though this show had the same sort of goal as Leave It to Beaver, it was 30 plus years later. This was the 1990s, and times had changed. And it's a little exemplified in this clip. This is one of my favorite lines and favorite scenes from the show. I love that line. "Do I look like a white guy named Ward?" Oh, that's great. So he said that, and again, I don't want to pick on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air because I do think it was a show that had heart to it and had some good redeeming qualities. But it does demonstrate that things were not the same anymore, right? Times had changed and things actually would only get worse. In fact, we've often noticed when we watch shows on Netflix and it seems like on the streaming services that there are always these nihilistic, cynical shows. Like they're completely devoid of all hope. There's no hope in a lot of the shows today. There's no optimism. There's no goodness and wholesomeness. And it's really, really frustrating because that's what I'm looking for when I watch art, when I watch shows and movies. I want to be inspired. I love redemption. I love optimism. So revisiting Leave It to Beaver is actually a breath of fresh air. It reminds me that there is value in the traditional family. There's value in pursuing healthy, loving, functional family life. That's what I wanted. That's what I'm pursuing. And that's my goal in this short series. We're just going to spend a couple more weeks in this series about families, but I want to, again, equip us to know what is and isn't a healthy family. to see improvement in our families. And this is what I think, again, I think I've already alluded to it. A family is supposed to be an environment in which the members of that family are protected, are guided, and free, in a sense, to grow into people of virtue. So you grow and become more and more virtuous, more and more have better character as a person. You make mistakes, but you learn from them, right? You're not shamed and punished, but you are guided and you're hopefully elevated. That's what I think is the value of the so-called traditional family. And what is a traditional family? It's the nuclear family. It's the idea of a man and a woman coming together in marriage, and they have children, and usually it's at least a couple kids, and that's what's considered the traditional or nuclear family. And I think there's value in that traditional family, right? And this is, weirdly enough, this is controversial in some areas of the world, in some areas of culture, that to embrace the traditional family and to say that there's value in it is to admit and to accept that there are differences between men and women. In other words, there's only certain things that men can bring to the family dynamic, and there are only certain things that a woman can bring to the family dynamic. And it's only when these people come together and form that family unit that they're able to benefit the family as a result. And again, like I said, that's kind of controversial in some areas, in some circumstances, right? But that's what the Bible presents. And please don't get me wrong, the Bible was written at a time when women did not have legal equal rights, right? Women were not valued as they are today. They weren't free as they are today. And we have to understand the Bible within that context. It's not appropriate to apply today's mentality and today's culture to the Bible. We have to understand the Bible in its context and then take and absorb the principles therein, right? And so I keep that in mind as I show you these scriptures here. Paul, if you read the end of Ephesians chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, you'll realize he's talking about the different roles of a family. And he actually says that husbands are to love their wives as Jesus, the Messiah, loved the church and gave himself for it. So, like, the man in the biblical worldview here is the head of the household, but he's not to be a tyrant. He is not to be the overbearing patriarch. He is supposed to be somebody who loves his wife and would do absolutely anything for her, including dying for her. That doesn't sound like a tyrant to me. It sounds like somebody, again, who's like Jesus, right? And what did Paul say in the next chapter there? He said, "Fathers, don't make your children angry." So, a person who loves his wife as Jesus loves us, and a person who endeavors to not make his children angry doesn't sound to me like the caricature that we hear that, fathers are, the tyrants of the family, the so-called patriarchy that we hear all about. No, biblically speaking and morally speaking, a husband and a father is someone who would do anything for his family, someone who meets the needs of the family, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, right? A father and a husband is somebody who demonstrates, and get this, a man, a real man, is somebody who demonstrates moral character, right? And I'm preaching to myself here because that's what it means to be a good father. You demonstrate to your wife and to your children, to your family, what it means to be of good character. And you lead by example. You don't tell your children what to do. You show your children what you should do, right? And what about women? So that's what the Bible says about husbands and men and fathers in that role. But what about wives? Well, again, let me reiterate. The Bible wasn't written even 50 years ago. It was written 2,000 years ago. So we have to understand it in that context. So to help us, I'm quoting here from the Message Bible, which is a paraphrase, right? This is not literal translation, but it helps us to see here. What did Paul say according to the Message Bible? That wives are to understand and support your husband in ways that show your support for Jesus the Messiah. So in the same way that you are devoted to Jesus, be devoted to your husband. The same way that you, as the literal translation is, submit to Jesus, you submit to your husband. And that doesn't mean you are erased. It doesn't mean you can't do what you want to do in life. It just means that if you are choosing to be a wife, that means it comes with a responsibility to partner with your husband, right? Not to be antagonistic towards your husband, but to partner with him, to uplift him, actually. And I've talked about this before, that there's actually nothing that a man wants more, I think, than to be encouraged and uplifted by his wife. There's nothing that gets us right here than when your wife really trusts you and really partners with you. So that's what women were expected to do, to be cooperative, maybe is another word, cooperative with their husbands, to be loving and nurturing mothers, right? Like if you think about what the Bible says about a woman and how she is to act, think about Proverbs 31, right? That famous passage. You know, if we like to think that women in the ancient world, in Bible times, were not valued, look at the value that Proverbs 31 places on the wife, right? And if you've never read that passage before, I encourage you to read that later today. Proverbs 31, and see just how much a biblical godly woman had responsibility and how much she was valued, right? And I think this is one of the most important parts of that passage. It says that she opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. The phrase teaching of kindness in the Hebrew there is Torah Chesed, which means the instruction of how you be devoted to God. I'm, obviously paraphrasing it here. How do you be devoted to God? What are God's moral rules? What are God's ways? How to be a good person, how to treat people with respect, how to love one another, how to be a part of a functioning, peaceful society. Mothers are supposed to teach their children that and supposed to demonstrate that. I think that's a big responsibility, wouldn't you say, right? That mothers have the responsibility of raising up the next generation. If we want a better world, it starts with parents, right? It starts with us raising up our children to be the kind of virtuous people that can actually produce a good world. I love politics, or I'm interested in politics and that sort of thing, but the real change is going to come when we have good families, families of virtue, right? So it is true that, obviously the Bible was written at a time when women were not seen as equals to men. But they still, even here in Proverbs 31, there's a whole strata of tradition in the Bible where it demonstrates that women were valued as a highly valued part of the family. But, of course, times have changed, right? We don't live in biblical times. We don't live in the 50s even, when Leave It to Beaver was on. Times have changed, and there are plenty of people today who look at the traditional family with disdain, right? There are lots of people who say, well, whatever, women should be able to do whatever they want. They should be able to go out and be with whomever they want, and they don't have to have kids and all that sort of thing, right? You have to understand, I'm speaking in very broad terms here. I'm not speaking in terms of specific situations or anything like that. But usually the disdain is distinguished upon these two lines. Those who have value for the traditional family are called conservatives, right? And those who maybe want more freedom or want more flexibility in that way, or even further, they will be called liberals, right? And my knowledge of history is not amazing, but I know enough to know that the liberal revolution, the sexual revolution of the past 50 years, is something where women wanted to be able to live their lives how they wanted to. If they didn't want to get married and have kids, they didn't have to, right? If they wanted to be with multiple partners just like men, they could, right? And I want us to think about this, right? Let's do some, I guess it's sociology maybe. That we think about how has that social experiment gone, right? 50 years ago, women began this movement to actually live as if they were men, right? To have multiple partners and to just be treated like men treat sex, right? But here's the thing. It hasn't really worked out. And sadly and ironically, the people who are for this sort of freedom are finding out that there's actually value in the traditional family, that there's value in the traditions that go along with that kind of family. I found this who here is on Twitter? Anybody here on Twitter? I'm somebody who is now constantly addicted to Twitter. I'm on there all the time. But I found this person who assembled a bunch of tweets from actual people. These are actual tweets that people wrote. And it's people who are definitely on the liberal side, however you want to look at it. And they are people who want that kind of sexual freedom. And here's what they have concluded after living that lifestyle for a while. This person said, I think contracts need to be signed before having sex. And a witness when signing the contract. Are you catching on here? Think about that. Contracts should be signed, and there should be a witness. And another person said that it's terrible. Men abandoning their children should be illegal. And then another person said, we ought to make it illegal to give away sex. And another person said that we should normalize sexless relationships. These are all real tweets. Real people actually said that. And what they're actually saying without realizing it is we should have marriage. We should have actual traditional marriage, that you shouldn't have sex before you get married, and that when you do get married, it's a legal thing, so that if something goes wrong, if somebody cheats, then there are legal ramifications for it. And men shouldn't be allowed to just abandon their children. There should be legal consequences for it. And these are all people who are, so-called liberals who are totally open to all kinds of different kinds of relationships, but they're seeing, without even realizing it, the value of the traditional family. Most of you know me, right? You know my views of society. I think that people should be able to live however they want. I believe in freedom, right? I don't think the state should have, be able to tell us how and what to do with our lives. But as free people, as people who have freedom, we should be thinking about maybe there's value in the traditional family. Maybe we should be trying to emulate Leave It to Beaver, right? It's not the 1950s. I'm not saying we go back to the way things were. I'm not calling for some kind of return to some kind of patriarchy. And I do think, of course, everybody should have the same equal legal rights, and everybody should have the freedom to do what they want. But within that freedom of choice, I think that we, as God's people especially, should be advocating for and promoting the traditional family. What did Jesus say? What did he say here? Look at this. Let no one split apart what God has joined together. And he's talking about marriage, right? Again, there's tons of caveats. In fact, my very next slide says, what about mixed families? What about divorce and remarriage? What about, gay couples? What about adoption? Literally think of any kind of different family other than the traditional family. Are those okay? Right? Well, here's the thing. When I talk about what is ideal and what is God's plan, that doesn't mean that the rest are not important and can't be valuable and used of God. Of course they can, right? In fact, next week, my message is called Real Life, the Brady Bunch. And that's because we're going to talk about how you can make a family out of anything, right? That families that aren't the traditional family can still be used of God and still be of value. But there is something about the traditional family that does and I think should have value to us. But here's the thing. Sarah, come on up. We're going to sing No Longer Slaves one last time. Here's the thing, and this is our phrase that we put out on the back of everything that we have, and of course on in the carport. You belong here. Why? Because that's what a family is all about, right? Belonging. To know that there are people who love you, right? Isn't that wonderful? That you know that there are people who love you. And here's the thing, if you don't have that in your actual family, in your blood family, then we're here, right? You belong here among us because we love you and we want you to know that this is a safe place where you can come and you can grow and be encouraged to grow in virtue. So that's the good news that we have as Christians, as people of God, is that we are a family. We are no longer slaves, as the song says, right? No longer slaves. We are children of God and we can be a part of God's family. Let's sing the song again.